toward the ordination in the Anglican diocese of Melbourne. It didn't work. But we were assigned, everyone was assigned a ward, it was part of the program, and our role was to cause an experience for the patients and the staff where they access their own hope in the midst of the busyness and suffering that's going on the ward. It was a difficult task. We were meant to be completely present, yet kind of invisible in this encounter. We were almost meant to be like a mirror for the patient to see themselves. And I made plenty of mistakes. But I think the best encounters were those where the patient had a good old whinge and then eventually came to their hope. And one day it was the start of the week, I remember it vividly, I was visiting this woman who was on the Anglican, this good Anglican woman. She was fine though, she was fine. She didn't really need me to say good day. Oh, hello, I'm Anglican, wonderful. But she said, look, the bloke next to me, JJ, I think he needs a visit. Now, there was a horrible smell of excrement and urine in the air. But there was also an air of humour in this room, and she made this comment, oh, he's such a character. Anyway, beds were both open between each other, there was no curtain there, but all I could hear was these groans coming from the next bed. And it wasn't due to any sickness. It was due to the fact we just mentioned about Collingwood, and they had this painful loss on the weekend. And so he had a good old-fashioned whinge about the pies and how they went through history, and we commiserated together, because of course I'm a Collingwood supporter too. So it gave us an immediate connection. Then he started asking questions about who I am, and I knew he wasn't real keen on Bible bashes. You're a Bible basher, eh? I've known a few Bible bashers in my time. Well, I managed to convince him, mate, I'm not carrying. So I had no Bible on me. I'm not a Bible basher. I'm just here to listen, mate. And so we got into his career about being a builder. I reckon he must have been a bit more like a labourer than a builder, but I'll let him be a builder. It was all the better to hear that he was a builder. And he talked about these houses that he built that he was mighty proud of. They were old-fashioned houses like the one I lived in, with lead-light windows and double brick and internal plastering and all this sort of stuff. And the nurse came in there and interrupted. And he seemed like a really jovial bloke. He was a character. And it turned mighty sour all of a sudden. He goes, what do you want? Like that. Wow, where's this coming from? This bloke seems so happy, so happy. He's in the moment. He was a good guy. He's a bit like a bloke's bloke. And she responded softly, you're going soon, JJ. And I thought, I wonder where he's going. He must be checking out, he's all right. Anyway, I asked him where he was going, and he throws me this piece of shriveled up paper. And then he has a crack at the nurse again. Oh, here you go, you probably want my money and my lollies and all this stuff. She just brushed it off. She probably heard it all before. Anyway, I opened up this shriveled piece of paper. Caritas Christi, Studley Park Road. He was going to die. He was going there with advanced stage cancer. His bodily egresses had given up on him. He actually said, my penis is here and my backside is here. It was that serious. What could I do but hold his hand as he suffered? And I prayed that he'd return to build those houses in God's kingdom. He wasn't really a churchy man, but I was present there in the moment. And it's a story like this that really changes you. It makes you realise that the same fate happens to all, the righteous and the wicked, whoever they are. And if we're all meaning-making, kind of like JJ, particularly at the end of our lives, we tend to dance around the real issues and find distractions before setting in on our real position and our real hope. I guess the message today, and the message that follows on from last week's sermon on Lamentations 3, is to train your spiritual muscle memory so that you can recall that Christ is in us, and that's the hope of glory. We heard that today in Colossians 3. And if you have that in your muscle memory, it's going to be there in the day of your trial when you're struggling. when you're about to go to care as a Christian. I'm thinking today in particular for our dear long-standing St James member and former warden, Carol Duke, and also any of those around us today here and also away. We pray for healing for them too, and for hope in their hour of darkness. Now I'm going to show you this from the text. It doesn't seem real obvious. It seems pretty grim, doesn't it? Well, what I'm going to try and do is walk through the text structure. There's three parts to it, I think, three main parts. Also going to add a little bit more from chapter 4 you haven't heard yet. I want to try and show you how lament works. And how the lamenter kind of dances around the issues by shifting blame onto others until they reach the truth. Then we'll jump over to Apostle Paul just briefly, with whom I struggle, but I think I'm a fair bit like him. I reckon we're all a little bit like suffering Paul. Before I start, I think there's a general principle in the Old Testament. It's not real obvious to us all, but it's there, particularly in the communal laments like the book of Lamentations, and also, funnily enough, the Asaph Psalms. That's my special area. And it's probably similar to our own way we react personally. Now, if Judah here perceives itself as being guilty before God, they'll ask for God to turn towards them and restore them to right relationship. Let's call that restoration, okay? Now, the second principle is if Judah perceives itself as being right before God, they're going to ask for judgment against an outsider, and that will serve as vindication for their own suffering. Now, let's call that vindication. We're going to use that principle when we come to the various parts of the text today. Well, first, I'd like to go back a little bit to the end of chapter 4. If you've got your Bibles there, it's probably not a bad thing to have them open to where they were. I think that was page 625. Now, the setting for chapter 4 is seriously lamentable. The lamenter ascribes God's anger against Judah as the reason why this is all happening. God's angry with Judah, therefore this is all happening. He's smashing everything. And it can't get much more gruesome than verse 10 in chapter 4, where it says, "With their own hands, loving mothers have had to cook even their own children. They ate their children when my people were destroyed." Doesn't get really a lot more gruesome than that, does it? Is that right, Suze? You're looking with horror. Yeah, you should be looking at horror. That's pretty bad, isn't it? And the lamenter then describes the people being banished like lepers by both the nations and also by God. Even their anointed one, which is also Messiah, their King Zedekiah. Not Messiah in the way we understand Messiah, but Messiah as King, which is where the anointed one, the one who's been anointed with oil, is set apart for a role. But look, here's the response to all that lament about mothers being cooked and all that sort of stuff. People of Edom, be joyful. This is from verse 21. You who live in the land of Uz, be glad. But the cup of the Lord's anger will be also passed to you. Then you will become drunk, your clothes will be stripped off. People of Zion, the time for you to be punished will come to an end. The Lord won't keep you away from the land any longer, but he will punish your sin, people of Edom. He will show you the evil things you've done. So Edom, apparently stemming from Esau's line, the one who was cheated by Jacob, who the birthright was cheated. The land of Edom was kind of at the south or the southeast of the Dead Sea. Edom, what's important here in the context of the book of Lamentations is that Edom stayed neutral when Judah was under attack. So that's a pretty good reason why they'd be upset with Edom. Now, question. Restoration or vindication? Vindication, yes, absolutely. Okay. That's the first one. Second, we're going to turn to chapter 5 now, and we see from verse 1, actually in the Hebrew text, it's everything says our past possessions. That's the first word in pretty much each verse, or each part of the verse. It talks about our inheritance, our houses, our fathers, our husbands, our drinking water, our wood for fire, our security, our rest, and our food. All our past possessions which are now gone. These are all memories of past glories. But here's a response to that. It's a little bit confusing, so bear with me. In verse 7 it says, our people have sinned before us have sinned, and they are now dead. We are being punished because of their sins. That's interesting. I think that what's going on here is probably a mistranslation in the NIRV. I don't want to make you upset here, but most other translations go with our fathers or our ancestors, and I think they're quite right. The word Abba means father, Baba, and Yomata. I'm sure there's other languages around here that have a similar word for father. And that's important. Let's not get that wrong. So I prefer this to be our fathers have sinned and they're no more. It is we who take on their iniquities. And if that's the right translation, I think it is. The second blameworthy figure is the fathers. This might include those who didn't pass on the testimony of God's wondrous works and goodness when they escaped from Egypt, when they wandered through the wilderness, when they entered into the promised land. And it might also include their sons and daughters and future generations who fell to idol worship. Restoration or vindication? Vindication. Two vindications. Okay, let's move on now. The lamenter then reflects, it changes tense in verse 9 quite distinctively. The lamenter reflects on our present condition, where, and the interesting fact is they are currently facing the sword in the wilderness, or they're facing the raging heat of famine. The word face and presence, for instance, the regular term for presence of the Lord, are almost indistinguishable in biblical Hebrew. They face devastation, they don't face Yahweh. And then the lamenter goes on to describe, in a past tense again, but really a historic telling, that the women were raped and the nobles were humiliated. The young men were turned to beasts of burden. And then we hear this term again. Remember from last week, for those of you who were here, the music. Or perhaps it's the mocking song. For those who weren't here last week, the term for music here, or song, in this case it's Mingitam, is actually often used in context as a mocking song. And it was our trigger word from last week. Last week we talked about how when you get to the lowest point, when you're really hitting the trough and back on the way up, there's a trigger for hitting the trough. And this is our trigger word from last week in verses 14 and 53 of Lamentations 3. So we've got there, haven't we? We've got a trigger word. And so we know the low point comes here next in verse 15 and 16. It says, there isn't any joy in our hearts. Our dancing has turned into sobbing. All our honour is gone. And then we see the turning point. It says in the second half of verse 16, how terrible it is for us because we have sinned. And we see the consequences of that in verse 17 and 18. These of Judah's works of iniquity that we heard the fathers had done earlier in verse 7. We don't know why these occurred. We don't really think it's necessarily that God's caused this affliction to fall upon Judah, as we heard in Lamentations 4. That's not said in the text. We haven't got that here. Oh, it's God's done this to us. No, I don't think that's quite so obvious in chapter 5. What's much more likely is that God has allowed Judah to follow the stubbornness of their own hearts and to suffer the natural consequences of it. In the Old Testament, natural justice is definitely a concept. What we do is related to what we yield. It sits deep in the heart of the ancient Israelite. And those who were here last week will recall that the low point's followed by the turning point. And we see that in the next verse, don't we? We see that in verse 19. Lord, you rule forever. Your throne will last for all time to come. Here's the moment of truth. Here's the turning point. This is where the patient has stopped dancing around the issues and actually got to the point, mate, My penis is here, my backside is here. I'm going home. I'm going to build houses somewhere else. Even in the midst of suffering, the lamenter knows that God is in charge. And the important word here in this verse 19 is forever. Because I think it's closely related to the word in verses 20 and 22 that God always forgets, or completely forgotten, or utterly forgotten. These two terms are actually related to each other. But I think the best way of thinking about it is, you rule forever, but have you completely forgotten us? Two concepts: bringing something to an end and things lasting forever. There's a strong contrast. God reigns forever, yet is completely and perhaps intentionally absent. In a worldview where God is inescapable, this is the most lamentable condition, perhaps even more so than the awful description we heard of the mothers cooking their children and eating them. We finish the book of Lamentations with a plea. Lord, please bring us back to you. Then we can return, make our lives like new again. The word return is used twice here, as well as renew. They all have the same idea, bringing things back to their rightful order. Now, our question: restoration or vindication? Restoration, that's right. You can see a pattern here, can't you? Oh, it's all about the Edomites. Vindication. La 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 la. It's all about the fathers. Vindication. Oh, actually, it's all about us. Restore us, Lord. Bring us back. We know we've sinned. That doesn't mean it applies to us all the time, but it's that process of reflection that the lamenter goes through that I think is a great pattern for us. You know, I was thinking, as I was writing this sermon, I remember this song, and some of you remember this, I hope, because I do. The hit from 1986 by Howard Jones. No one is to blame. And the song is quite interesting. I had a look at its lyrics because I never really thought about it. Do you remember Howard Jones? Really big hair, British person. I love that song. And it contrasts our desire to want everything with the obvious fact that we're never going to be able to have everything. And it anticipates that the human reaction is actually to say, well, it's not fair that we have to live like that. Like here's the first verse. You can look at the menu, but you just can't eat. You can feel the cushions, but you can't have a seat. You can dip your foot in the pool, but you can't have a swim. You can feel the punishment, but you can't commit the sin. And you want her, and she wants you. We want everyone, and you want her, and she wants you. This is the good part. No one ever is to blame. Does anyone remember that song? Yes! I reckon we all got to go home and listen to Howard Jones. Like, oh, I like his music. It's very ditzy and keyboardish, isn't it? Yeah, but I like it. No one ever is to blame. You know what? Things happen in our lives, for better or for worse, and God still reigns forever. He does that through his Son, Jesus Christ. Though divine, humbled himself to human form in life and death and was raised in glory. Jesus Christ reigns forever. With the Father, he sent the Holy Spirit among us. And so Paul, the character we heard from this morning from Colossians, is a man who found out just how much he had to suffer for the gospel of Jesus Christ. And he's the one who can say that Christ is in your life. When he appears again, you will also appear with him in heavenly glory. So we have hope right now and in the future that Christ is in us. And that's the thing we've got to remember. That's the thing we've got to put into our muscle and memory, to train your spiritual muscle so you can recall that Christ is in us, and that's the hope of glory in the day of your trial. I think that this is the trick of lament. I just wonder, whether it's best to actually do this by putting the old age truth at the bottom of the page when you write your lament. Shove there. Lord, you rule forever. Your throne will last for all time. Christ in you, the hope of glory. And then at the top of the page, have a good whinge. And what you might just find is that the lament actually does exactly what we just saw in the passage. Vindication, vindication, restoration. And that is to train your spiritual muscle for the day you try. May your laments be ones that end in an expression of hope and a vow of praise when it's fulfilled.
I invite the band up. The band's going to start with a new song. Well, it's new to us here at St James. It's been around for a while. Come to the altar. And so, if you don't know this song, feel